Talk about works of three philosophers today, Jean Gebser, and then in the afternoon will be Arthur Young, and finally we'll finish up with William Irwin Thompson. William Irwin Thompson is the only living individual out of this group. He's just past 60, just finished up his second Saturn return, and he's still alive and teaching out on the East Coast. And Arthur Young, on the other hand, is the only person in this entire group who is specifically interested in astrology, and his entire system is something that was inspired by astrology, at least initially. So we'll look at that later this afternoon. And with respect to Jean Gebser now, Gebser is another one of these Germans, so we'll have another one of the sort of German showers of concepts here. And Gebser was, now this is the next generation coming along here after Spengler. Gebser was born in, I believe, 1905, and Arthur Young, by the way, is born in the same year. Arthur Young just died a few years ago in his 90s. He was living out in Berkeley, and so he lived to be to a very ripe age. And Joseph Campbell actually came out of this group as well, because his birth date was in 1904. So these men all represent the new generation coming along after Spengler and Young and Steiner. And now a couple of things, I just want to preface this by saying there was a couple of things about Spengler's vision that bothered me. Not so much the pessimism, really, or the insights into, these great lyrical insights into culture history, but his attitude to modern art. I think there's something wrong there, because he sort of says, all classical music after Wagner, all painting after the Impressionists is garbage. Basically, it's false, it's ineptitude, it's no good. Now, one of the things that bothered me was that I started out reading the works of Joseph Campbell, and Joseph Campbell was sort of led me to Spengler. But in Joseph Campbell's work, coming along here in the next generation, the modern art movement was to him the primary revelation. Campbell had spent his career studying the works of the novels of James Joyce and Thomas Mann. And his favorite painters were Picasso and Paul Klee. And when I studied these things, and the poetry of T.S. Eliot and all this great modernist stuff, when I studied these things, these works did not at all seem to me to be works of decadence, but they seemed to be works that were an absolute revelation of spiritual energies. These men were all bringing in the whole mythological universe and updating it, making it contemporary. And so that bothered me about Spengler. While I do still think that his thesis about the disintegration of Western culture does hold for the most part in the 19th century, his conservatism with respect to modern art just sort of bothered me. So, and the same thing really with respect to Young, because Young wasn't much interested in modern art either. He was, like Spengler, a very intensely conservative man and really interested in the past and not so much in what was going on in the present day. He tried to read, for example, Joyce's Ulysses, and got very frustrated with it and sort of wrote Joyce a letter that was kind of a temper tantrum on paper, and it's very amusing. But so here, Campbell comes along, and Campbell and Gebser and Arthur Young are part of the next generation coming along, and for them, the whole modern art movement, there's a whole new revelation of spiritual energy coming through this. Now, I tend to think that there's a certain generational thing here, because Campbell, in his turn, the generation, for example, that William Irwin Thompson came out of, the next one after Campbell, I forget Thompson's birth date, it's in I think it's 39. For that generation when it was coming of age in the 60s, you began to get the explosion, modern art fell away, and you got the explosion of popular culture. The Beatles come along, and you get this whole world of movies. Movies come into their maturity finally in the late 60s. That art form gets going off the ground. And meanwhile, the novel is just sort of, twittering away. All these classical art forms, painting is on its last legs. You get a few last gasps with Jackson Pollock and Francis Bacon, and then that starts to fade off. But really, the new thing during that period of time was popular art, popular culture. And indeed, in my own, coming out of this sort of Generation X period, where the culture that I grew up with was, all comic books and bestsellers and science fiction movies, and that was sort of the culture that I came out of. Whereas Joseph Campbell had said that he had never seen a movie, And he had felt, for example, that when pictures went over to the talkies, film fell apart. That's how far behind he was. And he had only seen 2001: A Space Odyssey, had gone to see that and recognized in it that it was a pretty good film, a good handling of symbolic forms. And then the only other film he ever saw was the Star Wars trilogy, when George Lucas invited him to come out and watch those films because, of course, as everybody knows, the Star Wars films were based on his books, The Hero with a Thousand Faces in particular. And he certainly loved those movies. And he did utter a comment after watching them out at Skywalker Ranch. He had said, I had thought art had truly died with Picasso and Joyce, but I guess I was wrong. So there was a kind of last-minute recognition that popular culture could achieve something worthwhile and something that's really in the grand sort of Faustian tradition of high art. So there's a kind of crotchetiness with respect to each of these generations, and I think we should factor that in mind when we think about Spengler's pessimism and the validity of his model. There is a certain overly pessimistic emphasis there. So with that little caveat, we'll move right into Gebser. The thing that I like about Gebser is that he looks at exactly the same phenomena that Spengler looks at, and he sees exactly the opposite. He sort of looks at the disintegration of cultural forms in the 19th century, and where Spengler sees these things falling apart, Gebser sees the birth of a whole new structure of consciousness. Now, Gebser himself, I don't know much about his biography. He was in Germany for a while, and coming out of the academic German milieu, and he moved to Spain during the Spanish Civil War. And in fact, his apartment in Madrid was bombed 12 hours after he left it. So he was very lucky in that respect. And then when World War II broke out, he made it over the border into Switzerland just after the border had closed, just before it closed, within about 2 hours. And so he lived most of his life as a Swiss citizen in Switzerland in the 40s and 50s. I think he died in the 70s. And so Switzerland has an interesting sort of cultural magnet, because remember, that was where Jung had set up his house, and Bollingen, and for a while Steiner had set up, that's where the anthroposophists today are, in Dornach in Switzerland. And we had Gebser there for a while. So that's what little I do know about his biography. He had a prodigious output of writings. Most have not been translated out of German. The only book that has, other than maybe one or two smaller scraps, is this big one, the EverPresent Origin, which, like Spengler's Decline of the West, is also a 2-volume work. And the first volume of that appeared in 1949, and the same year, by the way, Joseph Campbell published his first great book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces, in 1949. And the second volume came out in 1953, and that was called The EverPresent Origin, both works. And so that's what we'll be looking at here. So I think the best place to sort of start to look at, before we get into Gebser's 5 structures of consciousness, I'll write them on the board just so we keep them in mind that he has. We're just dealing with these 5 structures. Instead of Spengler's 9 cultures, we have the archaic structure of consciousness, the magical, the mythical, the mental. He also calls it the perspectival, although the perspectival represents actually the second half of the mental, and then the integral, which is the one that he saw coming into being at the end of the 19th century, also known as a perspectival. So those are the 5 structures we'll be dealing with. Another thing that Gebser has, before we get into it, that Spengler doesn't, is regard here for the aboriginal cultures, the archaic and the magical. Spengler didn't really talk much about any of the aboriginal civilizations, doesn't talk about prehistory much at all in The Decline of the West. However, I think he realized that it was a mistake towards the end of his life, because he had befriended another one of these German culture figures named Leo Frobenius. And Leo Frobenius was this big explorer of African art and African sculpture, and he was responsible at the turn of the century for bringing a lot of African art into France and into Europe, and for helping to contribute to the modern art movement.